Property ownership comes with a lot of questions, and when damage happens, those questions get a lot more serious. Restoration 101 is a resource for property owners, managers, and industry professionals who want straight answers about the restoration process, the insurance process, and how to make smart decisions when it counts. This is Restoration 101, brought to you by Restoration One of Austin.
Welcome to Restoration 101. I am Robert Martinez. I am Vice President of Development. And here I have got one of our project managers, and you are?
I'm Hector, one of the project managers here at Restoration One of Austin.
If you can you give us a little bit of your background and how you got into all this?
Sure. So I started off really as just a helper. It was a summer job when I was finishing school in San Antonio. Throughout the years, I'd come back temporarily and work during Christmas break, summer break, things of that nature. Throughout the course, I started gaining a little bit more experience in the restoration industry. I'm a technician. Afterwards, did sales for about 3 years and naturally developed an interest for project management. So I've been doing project managing here for the last year and a half or so.
Wow, so you've kind of been in the restoration industry for the better part of a decade, and you learned it from the ground up.
From the ground up, yes, sir.
The fact that you've been in it now for almost a decade means that you kind of like it.
Keeps you on your toes.
And as a homeowner myself, and I know you are too, this learning this industry and all the ins and outs and how to navigate so many different things within this industry, it's a lot of useful knowledge that a lot of people don't know.
Oh yeah.
And so I was guilty of it when I got into this whole deal. I had a homeowners insurance policy, and I figured, yeah, I was covered. Without now being in the game for 8 years, I know, like most homeowners, I have no idea what my policy covers or what it doesn't cover. Now that I'm in it, I know all too well. And so whenever a situation that plays out like that, where there's an unfortunate event, where there's either a drain backup or a supply line failure or an appliance failure that's caused damage, it can be a very traumatic state. What, in your process, what does the homeowner have to do once something has been made aware that there's a failure that has happened?
Well, Robert, I would say the first step is really just identifying the shut-off valve for that source of water, whether that be a sink, a water heater, any type of water system in your home. Really, the key first step is identifying what's leaking and how to turn that off. That's going to prevent water from spreading any further, causing secondary damages, things of that nature.
So as a homeowner, once that has taken place, then what happens?
Afterwards, you kind of take a step back, kind of compose yourself, as you can imagine. A lot of times you may not know exactly where to start, right? If it's a plumbing leak, definitely want to reach out to a professional and get that plumbing source addressed. If it's something that, you left the sink on overnight while you're half asleep, you want to make sure you get that water turned off. And afterwards, I would recommend reaching out to a professional like us to go out and essentially provide a complimentary inspection of the property to help identify what type of materials are affected, create a drawing plan, figure out whether any extraction services may be needed. Really just try to help identify what the severity of the damage is going to be and get rolling on it.
So in a scenario where it was, say, an appliance like a dishwasher or something, it wasn't the sink that had been left on while you went to sleep. But what does the homeowner need to do?
For an appliance, like let's say it's a dishwasher, they have identified the dishwasher was leaking mid-cycle at night or whatever the case may be. Turn off the dishwasher. Let's make sure that we're not reutilizing that or reintroducing more water into that space. Same thing. You either call an appliance technician to come out, assess what part failed, or a plumber. A lot of times it's easier to call a plumber and they can, more or less guide you in the right direction versus a technical, because at that point you're not sure if it's a drain line for the dishwasher, if it's a supply line for the dishwasher, or a gasket at the bottom. It could be a combination of things sometimes.
So in the process, when should a homeowner reach out to a mitigation company to go in and start, I guess, the process of drying everything up?
I would say shortly after we address what the source of that loss is going to be, right? So whether if it was a dishwasher, let's make sure we turn that dishwasher off. If it's a sink, let's make sure we turn that sink off, and then immediately after reach out to a water damage professional.
what is the process for a homeowner? Because it's a traumatic event, there's water all over the place. They just called the plumber. Plumber's out there getting the work done. There's water everywhere. They're not exactly sure what needs to take, what steps need to happen next. What is a homeowner looking at that point?
I would say really it could vary, honestly. So I would say immediately reach out to a restoration company like us. Essentially, we have an 800 number, and that number takes calls at any given point throughout the day, at night. And if it's an emergency, we'll essentially go out and we'll immediately dispatch. Once we're there, we can truly assess what's going to be needed and what those next steps are going to be.
That's what I was going to get into next. So now, once a call has come to you, and then okay, you deploy or go out to the home, then typically what happens then?
Afterwards, once we're on site, we do a very thorough evaluation of the property, right? We want to identify what types of materials are affected, how many chambers are affected, whether it's a small room or if it went into a multifamily housing issue or multiple floors, multiple units may be affected. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to provide that very thorough evaluation of the property. And then depending on what that damage is, we can then help you identify what those next steps are going to look like, as far as providing a plan to mitigate those materials, whether that be removing drywall, baseboards, extracting water from carpet, removing insulation. And afterwards, we can more or less help you figure out which route would essentially be in your best interest as well. Most commonly, you have two routes to navigate through. You have a self-pay route, or you also have the option to essentially file a claim and get a claim filed through your insurance provider.
But can you go ahead and run me through the process on the secondary route?
Yeah. So again, we take a lot of the pressure off the homeowner. It's a very stressful situation when you're first going through it. So what we do is we can help jump on a phone call with the claim center, depending on who your provider is. We'll reach out. Really, all they need to do is just verify your policy information, your contact information. And then after that, we take some of the load off as far as providing the insurance provider with the information they're going to need, right? So, typically, they ask, again, how many rooms are affected, how long the leak was going on for, what type of materials were affected, and then essentially are able to then provide you with a claim number in order for you to, pretty much proceed with the claim.
And so on the self-pay route, how does that normally work?
Self-pay routes, let's say your deductible is not in line with the extent of the damage, right? Let's say you're not going to exceed it, or you just don't want to use your insurance at that point. What we can do is we can essentially provide an itemized estimate for the extent of the damage. And that essentially is a way to take care of the water damage itself without necessarily having to go through any third parties. At that point, we're working directly with you in order to mitigate the property, get everything pretty much structurally dried out and ready to go for reconstruction.
So you go out there and then you have that conversation with the homeowner. They decided to open up an insurance claim. Typically, then at that point, or do you just reach out to the insurance company and then open it up, or how does that work?
That's the first step, right? We help you open up the claim if that's the route that you were wanting to navigate through. After the claim is filed, they're going to request quite a bit of information in order for them to process the claim. The first step really is to take pictures, a bunch of pre-loss pictures. So we take a lot of photographs, videos, anything that's going to be helpful to the adjuster as far as getting them the information that they're going to need in order to process the claim, helping them kind of get a better idea of what's happening out in the field. From that point on, we then essentially provide moisture maps for them, moisture readings, a brief scope of more or less what's going to be needed, pretty much everything they're going to need in order to process the claim from that point on.
Okay. As far as stuff, whenever it comes into dealing with insurance companies, kind of what's some of the pushback you hear from insurance companies in relation to claim approval or denial?
That's a great question. I would say really the main pushback is not being proactive enough to mitigate the loss. So that's probably one of the first ones or the most common ones that we get. It's important to act fast when we're experiencing water damage, not only to mitigate the extent of the damage, but also to prevent secondary damages as well. So what we want to do is, again, we want to act fast. From experience, every claim is a little bit different. Right? Typically, you want to try to minimize the extent of the damage to that property, both from our standpoint and also from the insurance standpoint as well. So you don't want to wait too long. You definitely want to essentially reach out to a plumber as soon as you identify that there might be an issue going on in your home. You don't want to let things kind of get worse or put it off until it's, at that point, it's too late. So I would say one of the biggest things is, again, being proactive. Other types of pushbacks that we get from insurance. Slab leaks are also one of those, tricky situations where it, again, all depends on how your policy set up. It's really up and, for the adjuster to interpret that policy and, essentially confirm or deny coverage. Slab leaks can be one of those things where, whether it's above the slab or in the slab or below the slab.
Now, for clarification, because we touched on something, and again, a lot of people don't necessarily know what their insurance policy says. A lot of people don't even necessarily know what a slab leak is. What's a slab leak?
A slab leak is essentially a leak in the concrete slab or the foundation of your home. Okay. Most homeowners are more familiar with the term foundation.
And typically what causes that?
Be caused by a couple different things. Most common here in Austin is our soil type. Everything I would say east of 35 typically was, back in the day, was farmland. So it shifts a lot, right? Throughout different stages of the year, we get a lot of rain. Here recently, our summers have been, pretty dry, we can experience a drought. So a lot of times what happens is your soil or your foundation is going to shift a little back and forth, right? Throughout the years. And during those periods of shifting, any water lines that are essentially ran in the slab itself are also shifting and moving a little bit. A lot of times there's concrete or, there's sleeves around those pipes. And as it shifts, it creates friction, or it could also be a weak point in that, in that line. And then it causes or springs a leak in that foundation. A lot of times you'll notice it by seeing water coming out through floorboards, or if, let's say, you have carpet, big old wet stain in your carpet. For those homeowners who have animals or pets, right? Oftentimes they think, sure enough, old Cooper, used the bathroom in the living room when in fact, it's something else. So those are always tough to identify. But we do get a good amount of pushback sometimes, depending on how the policy set up on.
Yeah, so going a little bit more on how a policy set up in relation to slab leaks. What do carriers?
Carriers will make that determination based on a couple different factors. So one of the biggest factor is whether that leak is above the slab itself. If it's above the slab, typically they would just, from our experience, they would just go ahead and classify it as just a normal claim. Depending on how the policy is interpreted or how it's set up, it may not cover water damage if it's below the slab and that water is then coming up through the slab and into the home.
Okay. And so what was the determining factor on either claim approval or claim denial on slab leaks? They get everything, I guess, based off of plumber's reports to make the determination on what it is and then what the endorsement is. How does that work between the plumber's report and then the endorsement on?
The plumber's report is going to be crucial.
Yeah.
It's going to be crucial, and it's going to be a big factor as far as the approval process, more or less, right? Normally what they would want to do is provide that plumber's report to the adjuster so that way they can identify where in the slab that leak was found.
Really? So they've got verbiage or details in the policy that states where the compromise is in the slab will be either approved or not.
Yes, sir. Yeah. A lot of policies will have information at the end of the policy where they'll go over specific situations like slab leaks. Another area where we get a lot of pushback is sewage backups, whether that backup is in the home or whether it's in the city line. Again, the policy will go a little bit into detail, but most importantly, the adjuster is going to be the one with that final determination.
Now, in your experience, when it comes to slab leaks, do carriers like to send adjusters to do a sidewalk?
Sometimes they do. I'd say after COVID, it really changed. Before COVID, before 2021, there was a lot of adjuster presence, a lot of site walkthroughs. It was very common. I'd say after 21, there was a lot of tools that were developed during that time to help and aid the need for that walkthrough. So a lot of times now we have tools that we can scan. There's, again, plumber's reports that can be sent over to adjusters. I would say on average, or if I had to throw out a number, I'd say 60% of the claims don't have adjuster site visits. When they do, we like to be there as well for the homeowner.
On mitigation stuff that you see day in and day out with regular claims, is there anything a homeowner should kind of be aware of, things that could get them in trouble if they tell an insurance company certain things?
There's a couple of things that can get them in trouble.
What might those be?
Mold is one of them. Mold can definitely get you in trouble. Mold can look and be present in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's dirt staining that can look like growth or mold. At the end of the day, I'm not a not a consultant, right? Or I'm not an environmental company, so I can't specifically test that stain on the wall and tell you 100% whether it's mold or not. It may not be mold, right? It may be, just staining due to dirt, contaminants in the water. It's a brown stain. It was maybe dirty water, right, from a drainage system. So a lot of times, as a homeowner, when we're not sure exactly how long a leak may be going on for, the big factor you think about is mold, right? I don't want mold to occur in my home, black mold in specific, right? Exactly. So a lot of times we as a homeowner, right, before going into this industry, you kind of think about those materials and kind of that verbiage that you hear. Everyone's probably had that vision of someone coming into their home with a full Tyvek suit, full face respirator, the severity or the worst case scenario. So oftentimes throw in that word mold, not knowing whether it is or if it's not mold. So at that time, sometimes it can become an issue with insurance, again, depending on how the policy is set up. Sometimes policies do offer mold protection and coverage. Sometimes they're capped to a certain limit. I've seen times where mold gets covered through insurance as well. So not necessarily saying that it can or will get you in trouble, but you definitely want to be considerate on when you're using the word.
Yeah, and so again, mold has been one of those crazy things that has evolved in the 8 years I've been doing this. Mold has taken off in the Austin area.
Yeah.
It's become a high-profile thing. A lot of data is now coming out on the health aspect of it, and at some point, as we do these podcasts, we're going to do a severe deep dive in mold coverage and everything that does go with that. Environmentalist, what's the difference between a restoration company that's got a license to remediate mold versus an environmentalist?
Yeah, so there's mold remediation contractors like us that essentially perform the act of remediating the mold. What that means is, in simple, plain terms, we're the ones in your house, full PPE, containment setup, negative pressure, and we're the ones that are essentially removing that mold physically, whether it be cutting out drywall, cleaning ducts, etc. And then there is environmental consulting companies. Here in the state of Texas, the mold industry is kind of split up into two sectors, right? There's mold remediation contractors like us, and then there is consultants who would essentially be able to do two things. They can essentially test and confirm whether you have mold in your home, what type of mold, what that spore count is, and based off of those test results, then essentially they are able to provide a mold remediation protocol, which will outline or provide a guideline on how to properly remediate that mold. Once the mold remediation is completed, right, by a licensed mold remediation contractor like us, they come back in, they do what's called post-clearance testing, in which they will run tests to certify that our services or our work is up to standard at that point.
So basically, if you get called into on a mold project and you work with environmentalists, they're going to give you the template on what they want you to do on the remediation side. Then you do the remediation work. They clear it, but then they do clearance testing. And if it's clear, then the house is free. It's free of mold.
Yeah, it's free of mold at that point, or it's within acceptable ranges. There's all types of mold, right? A lot of times, again, we freak out when we hear mold and we think it's the black mold, it's a super toxic spore. We're actually exposed to a lot of different spores out in nature naturally. You'll see in the news where, everyone has their phones now. You'll see the air quality, right? Those are all pollutants that are in the air. So again, it just depends on what's out there. Normally what they do is, what consultants will do is they'll take a sample from an outside, uncontrolled sample, and then they'll compare it with a sample from inside, and they'll determine again whether those mold spores are in acceptable ranges.
Yeah, because I know we're getting ready to come into March, and I know with allergy stuff, I open up my weather app, and then it always gives me the mold count.
Allergies.
Right. And so, well, if on the clearance testing stuff, do you typically see a spike in mold remediation inquiries during the spring?
We see it in the spring, and I would say in the summer as well. Personally, I think the reason for that is due to the conditions. A lot of times, if mold can be tied into typically a long-term leak, right? So let's say there's a leak or something got wet, right? An overflow from a bathtub that was just left untouched. certain conditions have to be met in order for it to continue to develop and grow. Right. So a lot of times we do see that in spring or maybe closer to summer when those conditions are more or less in favorable for that development.
So if you, to circle this back around then, say you've got, because we've touched on, you have 12 months to file a claim, and then you've touched on, okay, they'd like to have a 2-week window of when you first notice something. Say you've got they call them a pinhole leak in a supply line inside of a wall, which is basically just a very, very small pinpoint leak that almost acts like a mister, like those misters that go inside of the wall. For somebody to notice that, that typically would take a long period of time. And so by the time a homeowner like myself actually is aware that there's a problem, there could potentially be a bunch of growth that is inside that wall that I'm not aware of. And so once you start doing mitigation work, does an insurance company typically try to pin it as being a mold job to deny coverage, or how does that normally work?
Again, it could vary, right? So, like you mentioned, a lot of times pinhole leaks will essentially start very small. Sometimes they do take a while for the average homeowner to see or any visible indications of whether this is going to be an issue. I would say the average untrained eye doesn't necessarily pick up on those things. My fiance and I have this thing where sometimes we'll go into like different properties or restaurants, and I'm able to pick up on certain things. Right? She laughs.
Doing it for so long.
So essentially, pinhole leaks can be tricky, right? Pinhole leaks are very tough to identify. That's why it's important that any leak that you do come across, you're essentially being proactive and you're reaching out to a professional like us to see and investigate a little bit further to see if the pinhole leak only caused damage to a small area, or in this case, a whole room is identified to be affected, right? Then that may indicate that leak may have been going on for a little bit longer than ideal. But ultimately, again, going back to how insurance plays a role into this, it really depends on the source of the leak and the overall factors with the specific project. So a lot of times, insurance companies aren't necessarily going to deny or approve coverage. They're going to want to essentially do a deep dive, right? They're going to want to see all those photos before, during, after, and then make their determination based off of that. Again, not necessarily going one way or another. At the end of the day, they really do factor in all of the factors, right? Everything that could have been going on, whether if it was a confined space that homeowners may not, be going into on a day-to-day basis. If it's something that, homeowner walks past through it every day and should have maybe seen that, it just varies.
If a homeowner, because you touched on environmental specialists being the ones that do the testing and then Restoration One being the remediators. So when does an environmental specialist need to come in? When do they need to call the specialist, or how does that work?
The homeowner does have the option to call in an environmentalist or consultant at any point, right? If they're feeling any type of allergies, any weird symptoms, right? There's a lot of consultants that will go out and just do essentially air quality testing. If there's something more particularly tying us to a specific leak, right? They can bring them in beforehand, right? Before we essentially get called in. Ideally, you may not always need an environmentalist for just a straightforward leak. Oftentimes, we open up walls and we do then find growth. And at that point, we stop our mitigation work, go ahead and seal up the wall or wherever that mold was found. And then at that point, we can recommend that they reach out to an environmentalist of their choice in order to, again, provide a protocol and provide further testing.
So is there any kind of definitive line or barrier that you get to where, okay, we're going to call somebody, or if it falls below a certain threshold, then it's like, okay, you don't have to worry about it?
Most commonly, they use the 25 square feet threshold. However, again, there's a lot of factors, right? So I wouldn't say there's a specific time where you may want to call someone in, but depending on your, different factors and whether it's going to become an issue or you think that it's a bigger issue than what you see. But I would say for a standard water leak where there isn't any, growth visible at the time, and as of right now, it's only water damage. The next step would probably be a restoration company like us. And then we can further assist you and say, yes, it's definitely necessary, or you're not in need. We didn't find any growth in the home. Everything was, pretty much straightforward from that point on.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, again, it's over the course of the last several years, it's one of these industries that a lot of data is coming out on the health side. It's gaining a lot of traction in the media. A lot of people are doing long form podcasts like this one, talking about mold in general and all the health impacts. So as everything progresses, it's only going to get bigger and bigger. So I know that we've seen an increase over the last year and some change on mold inquiries coming in into our office.
Mold inquiries, the type of protocols as well. Certain doctors and physicians that are now getting involved in the
Really?
in the process as well. Where before it was really just homeowners.
One of the things that's really good about SOPs and processes when it comes into the documentation side is, as a general rule, whenever something like this has happened in a home, in order to protect yourself from liability down the road, it's good that you reach out to a worthwhile mitigation company, no matter who it is, in order to get that process taken care of as it needs to be, and to have that proper assessment in, especially within the first 24 to 48 hours to set the table for proper restoration work.
Of course, I would say the most important part again is getting a professional, whether that be us or a restoration company, in the door to again more or less identify what type of services may be needed. Again, and let us more or less help with that burden as far as not knowing which route you more or less would want to go through or what the next steps are going to be. We can again provide different options for you to explore and point you in the right direction at the end of the day.
That's a wrap on this episode of Restoration 101. Whether you're dealing with damage right now or just getting ahead of it, we hope you're leaving with something useful. Subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if we earned it, leave us a review. It helps more people find the show. We'll see you next time. This is Restoration 101, brought to you by Restoration 1 of Austin.